Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. The ancient Roman Emperor Constantine, leading the legions into battle, saw an apparition in the sky. It was a cross, Christian cross, and underneath that cross were the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign conquer. And then he heard the voice of God telling him, copy this design, put it on your banners, and you will conquer, and you will come home safe from all your battles, and you'll be victorious. So the Catholic Church had, at that point in time, under his in his empire, had become the official religion of Rome, and consequently we know it as Roman Catholicism today. And they shortened in hoc signo vinces to simply in hoc signo, or I.H.S. And I.H.S. is sort of the Catholic acronym, for the brand of Catholicism, very much like AT&T stands for the Telephone and Telegraph Company, and IBM serves a similar purpose for their company. Well, let's fast forward to the 20th century in Dublin and recall the words of Brendan Behan. Brendan Behan was an Irish poet, playwright, novelist, and humorist, and he's a professional Dubliner. He was a great character. And he tells the story of his upstairs neighbor who was the local seamstress. And let's call her, for want of a better name, Mrs. Murphy, just for our purposes here. I don't even know that Brendan mentioned her name when he referred to her. In any event, Mrs. Murphy was the local seamstress. She made his communion suit, and it's kind of hilarious because she made him a nice little blue suit as a child, and she had one button from a woman's coat, a big white button that she put in the middle of it. So they had a beautiful suit with this white button that everybody laughed at. But the suit was nice. She also made shrouds for all the dead in the neighborhood. They couldn't afford caskets necessarily, and so they had shrouds, linen shrouds, and she would embroider I.H.S. And as a little boy, he saw these things, and he asked her, he said, "Mrs. Murphy, what does I.H.S. stand for on the shroud?" She goes, "I have suffered." He said, "Oh boy." And she says, "Yes, all of these people have suffered." Well, I had 14 years of Catholic education, and the Catholics, especially the educators, claim to be building character. They're very good at it, and that's one of their selling points. They certainly built my character, but I certainly suffered. I started school in 1950 in first grade at St. Agnes in Brooklyn, and I even remember the day I started school. I had Sugar Crisp, Post Sugar Crisp, just brand new cereal, the first sugar-coated cereal ever. And I wanted it because I saw it, and my mother bought it for me as a gift, to celebrate my first day of school. And there I was in little navy blue short pants and a white shirt, starched, and a blue knit tie with the gold lettering embroidered SAS for St. Agnes School. If you wore a red tie, that was the devil's color. You couldn't do that. You were going to go straight to hell. So we had a blue tie with that. And my mother told them at the school when she delivered me for the first day of school, we had to go to the schoolyard. And they had segregated schoolyards. They had two schoolyards. One on one side of the building was for boys only, and the other side of the building was for girls. And she told them, my son knows how to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And so they got me up in front of everybody, and I recited the Pledge of Allegiance, which made me a big hit with the nuns, because I'm a little kid, and I hadn't been in school, and I knew the Pledge of Allegiance. And so I got a good start. But St. Agnes was an ancient place. Even in those days, it was ancient. It was so ancient that the desks had a hole in them up in the upper right-hand corner, which was for an inkwell. And you had to mix the ink with water. The indigo, whatever it was in the dye, and then you'd mix it. I became, I think in the third grade, I was an ink monitor, which means I could mix the ink and then distribute it in the little inkwells in each desk. And we had pens that were like wooden quills with metal nibs that you could replace. You could buy them for a couple of cents at the store. And we'd have to dip. We learned to do longhand writing in third grade. And we had to dip pens. And you couldn't use ballpoint pens, which just came out, that was also a devil's instrument, and it was no good for handwriting. So we had to use the inkwells and the pens. Well, I also remember being in the school plays. Every year they'd have in June they have a school play, and I was the lead singer in two different plays. I think the second grade and the third grade. In the second grade, it was all about cowboys and out west, and I sang a solo or a duet, "Don't Fence Me In." And the next year it was we had Sister Santa Maria, who uncharacteristically was Italian. Most of the Sisters of St. Joseph who ran the school were Irish girls and Irish American, or even from Ireland, some of the older ones. And we sang, we had Sister Santa Maria, we had a school play that talked about Italian culture, and I sang a solo, Santa Lucia, which is an old Venetian song about the boatsmen in Venice. So I also became eventually an altar boy, but that came later on. Discipline in the early grades, Sisters of St. Joseph were masters of verbal and psychological discipline. I remember in the first grade, I was talking something and I was out of order, and the nun told me, Mr. Greco, repeatedly, tried to stop me, and about the third time she said, "Okay, Mr. Greco, if you continue in this behavior, I'm sorry to say you will be ostracized." And I looked, I said, I didn't know what the hell ostracized meant, but it sounded bad. I didn't want to do it. Worked. I shut right up because I was going to be ostracized, and it sounded horrible. And all the Sisters of St. Joseph, they must have gone to the same school of discipline. They all used the same measures verbally and otherwise. The other verbal measures were they would grab you by the collar and shake you and tell you, me, Mr. Greco, you're bold as brass. The other thing they would say to me is, Mr. Greco, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Now you get busy. They would get me back to doing my work. Well, I went to St. Agnes for the first 3 years and then part of the fourth grade. In November of that year, in the fourth grade, my family moved to Queens, and I had to go to St. Michael's, which was not my local parish, but my local parish had a brand new elementary school, which was just being in the final stages of construction. So for that year, that 1 year, from November until June, that school year, I was in St. Michael's. Well, here I am, a little kid, I think maybe in the fourth grade, I'm 9 or 10 years old, and it's my first day in St. Michael's in another borough, and a nun walks in the classroom, and before she says a prayer, or before we recite the Pledge of Allegiance, the nun says, "Which one of you is Mr. Greco? Stand up, I want to get a look at you." There I was, 10 years old, a marked man. Apparently, the nuns in Brooklyn called the Sisters of St. Joseph, their colleagues in Queens, to warn them of me. And I was marked in fourth grade. Well, so much for that. That's not such a great thing to be a marked man with the Sisters of St. Joseph. So that went on. I got through the year, and I changed again, this time to my local school in Flushing, St. Anne's, which was brand new. And I was in the oldest class. It didn't open up from 1st to 12th grade, or 1st to 8th grade, rather. It opened up from 1st through 5th grade. And I was in the 5th grade class, so-called seniors of that school. And every year they would expand, and then we would be the first 6th grade, the first 7th grade, and finally the first 8th grade graduating class. Well, my career at St. Anne's was filled with action. Because at that point in time, around the 4th graders, the kids start getting mischievous. And I got mischievous. We had 60 kids in a class, one nun. And the nun would invariably focus on the kids who needed the most help. I was not one of them. I was one of the kids who got the highest marks in the class. If not the highest, the second highest, or right there. Problem was, I finished the work quickly. The nun would be working around with other children at the other end of the class. And my idle mind was the devil's workshop, and I went to work, and I got in trouble for everything because they had nothing for us to do. There was no extra work for the kids who could handle the work. You just waited around for the nun to catch up, and the poor nun was stretched. And that's where I picked up the name with my best friend and neighbor and arch nemesis, all of the above. My friend Stevie Drolet and I were known to the 5th grade nun as matches and gasoline. So they used to separate us, They'd put matches in one end of the room and gasoline at the other end of the room, just so we couldn't be together. Well, also at that grade, from 4th grade on, you started coming into corporal punishment. And the Sisters of St. Joseph, which I now had at all 3 schools, I couldn't get away from their clutches here. I was a prisoner of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I ate brown soap because I think I said the S word in class once in the fourth grade or fifth grade. I'm not sure. I did punish lessons such as write "I will behave" 1,000 times. So you write I down the page. Will behave, 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 and you keep doing till you hit 1,000 after school. It was ridiculous. That ruins your handwriting, which you were trying to teach you penmanship, but that didn't help. And the other thing they did was they would sit you in the waste paper basket in the front of the class. You'd have to sit in the basket. Well, they stopped with me because as soon as I sat in the basket at the front of the class, I had an audience. Now, it was really good. So it was counterproductive for them. So I didn't have to sit in the basket very much, more than once. But I also got hit. I got hit with everything they could lift in the classroom, including pointers, rulers across the knuckles, books. I got slapped. My hair was pulled. My ears were pulled. My sideburns were pulled. And to make matters worse, I would be one of these kids. When I got in trouble, I would start laughing nervously, and they thought that I was being, defiant, and I would just turn up the heat and the punishment. And I had in the fifth grade a mighty mite of a nun called Sister Catherine Anita. She had 6 kids, and 60 kids in class, and she wasn't really up to the job. Most of them were, but she really wasn't. She had a fierce temper, and she was violent. In fact, looking back with the distance of my whole life, the worst beating I ever caught in my life was from Sister Catherine Anita in the fifth grade. And I'm talking amateur boxing. I fought the inter-service and Army welterweight champ. I had some tough fights. I had dozens of street fights. I had some bar brawls when I worked in the World's Fair on Bourbon Street. And all of those notwithstanding, the worst beating I ever caught was from Sister Catherine Anita. She went over the top. And my mother came up and squared that away and let her have it. And usually, in those days, if you got in trouble, your mother and your father would pin you against the wall for embarrassing them, So it wasn't like my mother was favoring me. She knew I was off the handle, but this nun had gone too far. And I never forgot that. I usually got a U in conduct, even if I got 97, 98 average. It didn't matter. I got a U in conduct. They couldn't put me on the honor roll because my U in conduct, And while I was there at St. Anne's, I became an altar boy. And in the days of the Latin liturgy, Ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam. That was the first thing I had to say in response in the Mass. And I became a master. And there were 3 positions of altar boy. You could be a master, which means you were the lead altar boy in even high masses involving the bishop or dignitaries or weddings or even some funerals if they paid for a high mass and they had multiple priests. The second one was a thurifer who held the incense for the priests. And the third category were acolytes who just stood around with the candles. And I remember in one benediction as a kid, I must have been dozing, and I was an acolyte, and I leaned forward, and my pompadour lit up. That caused a little excitement in the class. That was typical of my career as an altar boy, which was mostly consisted of initiations, playing ring alivio in the schoolyard while the mass started, and the pastor had to come and get us to come in and help. Smoking in the schoolyard, that sort of thing. But I survived all of that stuff. And in those days, the altar boys used to help at Palm Sunday. On Palm Saturday, we'd have to strip the palms. The palms would come in, and we have to strip them so that they would be in single leaves to give out to the congregation. And I remember throwing them around, like spears. I even have a scar over my right eye, or next to my right eye where I got hit. Lucky I didn't get hit in the eye. But it was full of mischief and a lot of fun. And eventually I moved on from there. And I graduated from St. Anne's in 1958. And 50 years later, actually 46 years later, because they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the opening of the school, which was 1954. And I went to the reunion, and there was one of my teachers, an elderly nun, Sister Catherine William. And Sister Catherine William, I went over to her and I said, "Excuse me, sister, I don't know if you remember me." She says, "Remember you? Mr. Greco, of course I can remember you." She says, "How could I forget?" She says, "And I remember your brothers, Robert and Richard, but they were good kids." God, she smiled, So there I was, still remembered after 50 years. I guess I made a mark on them. They certainly made a mark on me. I guess I made a mark on them, too. And it's really funny about not being able to escape the clutches of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Even today, I go to St. Mary's Cemetery in Flushing every week to take care of flowers at my mother's grave and my mother-in-law's grave. And not 100 feet from my mother's grave is a hill with a statue of St. Joseph above it and two guardian angels. It's a burial ground for the Sisters of St. Joseph. There's so many of them there, including my former principal, Sister Mary Madwina, who was from Ireland. She was a great old gal. And I walk by sometimes and I say, "Hi, girls," and I can hear them whirring in their grave, this whirring sound. Oh, he's back. And I laugh to think of the memories. Well, I moved on then, 1958, to Xavier High School in Manhattan, which was a Jesuit-run military school. And I was there for a year. And the school was filled with a lot of children of the rich and famous around New York City because it's a very prestigious school. But I was not one of the rich and famous kids, and I hung out with the outlaws. We gravitated. The nuns used to say, "Birds of a feather flock together." So there I was with one guy, a Ukrainian from 7th Street in Manhattan, right near the school, another Italian guy from Harlem who was a gang leader in Harlem of the Red Wings, and another Irish kid from Jackson Heights. And the four of us were like outlaws because we were street guys. And the freshmen had to eat lunch with the seniors. And it's a military school, so the seniors are all officers. The freshmen don't even have a rank. They're all privates. And the officers have certain tables. And I remember one big shot officer, captain, coming over, a football player, all of this stuff, and he wanted us to get up from that table. So this is our table. Well, the four of us got up and practically jumped on him. He got scared and walked away. He never bothered us. We sat at that table. Nobody ever bothered us. But the problem was the prefect of discipline, Father William McDonough, otherwise known as the Moth. Why was he the Moth? Because he could walk around the school silently and you wouldn't know where he was and he would be right behind you, so we called him the Moth. And he was a character and I had to match wits with him every day because I would be in detention every day. Every day in my year at Xavier, I only went for 1 year. My parents got divorced and I used that occasion to wangle my way out of Xavier. But while I was there, they have JUG. JUG is detention. This was Xavier military slang for detention. They had a courtyard, an indoor courtyard, and you had to march around the courtyard with these heavy Springfield rifles, which were really heavy and drill. And sometimes they'd make you walk just around one little square of pavement, for extra punishment. And you had to walk around there. And I was in there every day. In fact, in the yearbook, there's my picture in JUG, marching around with the rifle. So matching wits with Father McDonough, guess who usually won? He won. And he had the upper hand. And eventually I took advantage of, I said, my parents divorced and I got out of Xavier. But it was a terrific education. In retrospect, I'm sorry that I left, but it was almost inevitable. Next thing I do, I show up at Flushing High School, otherwise known as Mount St. Flushing or Our Lady of Flushing. And Flushing, after 9 years of Catholic school and strict discipline, was a holiday. And I started off with 41 days of hooky, cutting classes at random, getting in fights. Again, that pattern followed all the time. I was always in fights. I guess also I was an angry kid with my parents' divorce, so I had a lot of hostility and anger. And Flushing was a great place because it was a big mixture of all different kinds of kids, and there were a lot of factions, and there was plenty of fighting going on. That's what we did. And in Flushing High School, I was banned from detention. I couldn't go to the regular detention. I had to go to the dean's office and sit in the dean's office. And the dean was a guy named Henry Schwartzapfel. Well, I sat there for 3 years in his office almost every day, and we became personal friends. When I was boxing, he came to some of my fights. He was a great guy. And later on, when I went to law school in Brooklyn at St. John's, for the one semester I was there at St. John's, is on Skimmerhorn Street, downtown Brooklyn, right near the headquarters for what was then the Board of Education. And I ran into, there I am in a three-piece suit, briefcase, looking lawyer-like, and I'm going down the street and I meet Dean Schwartzapfel. And I said, "Dean Schwartzapfel," he goes, "Rudy Greco, look at you." He said, "You got a suit on?" I said, "Yeah, "Oh," he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I go to St. John's Law School." I said, "How about you?" He said, "Well, I'm here at the Board of Ed, looking after my pension. I had to iron out some details with in the bureaucracy here." I said, "Well, you better get your pension quickly because I'm going to graduate and I'm going to be mayor of New York and you're not going to get your pension. Do you understand?" And he started to laugh. And that was the end of that. While I was in law school, I went back to visit Flushing High School. And I wasn't allowed in. John, the cop, who was the New York City cop, was assigned to security. He was the only guy in the school for security. He refused to let me in. I said, "John, please, no, thank you. sorry, Rudy, no offense. He said, but he wouldn't let me in to visit the school. So that was my reputation following me around Flushing High School. I then went on to St. John's University after Flushing High School. And by the way, at Flushing, I got a Regents College scholarship. I remember walking into Dean Schwartzaffel's office the day I got the scholarship. And he said, "Oh, I know. You got a scholarship. You got an academic scholarship, right, Rudy?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what. You take it to JC's Billiard Academy where you hang out and put it up on the wall because that's the only academy or academic place that's going to take you." I said, "Yeah, we'll see." And anyway, I went on to St. John's and we had a few laughs. At St. John's, my career continued with this time now the Vincentian Fathers. And at St. John's, I initiated unlimited class cutting, which was not the style at that time. You had to go to class, but that didn't bother me. I approved my own programs because I was working. And I was working as a steam fitter in the holiday periods and the summertime. And my senior year, I remember working for Eastern Express from 12 to 8 in the morning. So I tailored my program always around what was convenient and what was compact so that I would have a certain time off and the days off that I wanted. But my programs had to be approved, and I would sign them D Duck or M Mouse. And St. John's is so big, nobody ever noticed until it was time for me to graduate. And I got called into the dean's office there, and I had to take 3 extra courses to make up for some deficit in credits that I needed that were required. And St. John's, I was also famous because I didn't have any parking passes, but I parked in the senior lot all the time when I had my car in the third and fourth year. And they surrounded me one day and took me to the dean's office, and I had to make good on some parking tickets that I had, many of them. But we made a deal as long as I stopped parking. And the graduation at St. John's, I was the last guy. I didn't want to go. My mother persuaded me to go. Finally, you have to go, you have to go, you have to go. So I was actually the last one to get there. I got there late. St. John's graduates about 3,000 people every year. It's a big school. And at the end of the procession are all the honored guests and mucky mucks, with the fancy robes and shawls that they would wear with all the different distinction for different fields of education and degrees that they had. And there I am walking down, putting on my robe as I walk down the aisle. All my friends are clapping and laughing and thinking this is hilarious, because I came right after the dignitaries, the bishop, and then came me, And the vice president of the university was Father Carey, and he was a great guy, a decent guy. And Father Carey reached out as I was passing him by, pulled me over, and he whispered to me in my ear, "I see you going out the same way you went through this place, Rudy. You get an A+ for consistency." And he laughed, and I walked and I got up there. There's one other thing I ought to mention about St. John's, which I thought was remarkable at the time. My friend Gino had tickets for the auto show at the Coliseum, and he couldn't make it. He had 2 tickets. And he said, "Why don't you take the tickets? I can't make it. I'm not feeling well." He says, "I'll give you the 2 tickets." It was the last minute. He says, "It's for tomorrow." So I called up. I had been working in the World's Fair at that time on Bourbon Street, and I was dating a go-go dancer, Marianne, the go-go dancer. She was also from the Peppermint Lounge, which was a big deal in those days. And Marianne, I said, "You'd like to go to the auto show?" "Sure." So I picked up Marianne on Sunday, and we go to the auto show. And Marianne, forget the cars. Everybody's looking at Marianne because there she is in short shorts. She got shorts up to her chin and a blouse down to her knees and chewing gum. And she had a great figure and she was a great looking gal. And everybody was looking at Marianne everywhere we went. Nobody was looking at the cars. And sure enough, I run into a priest, Father Vincent Nugent. Vincent Nugent was one of the most handsome guys you'd ever want to meet in your life. He looked just like Tyrone Power, the actor. All the girls in St. John's used to swoon over this guy, and he used to ham it up because he wouldn't wear an overcoat. He wore a cape, a black woolen cape, He was, and I said, "Father, how are you?" He said, "Rudy, I'm not asking how you are. I could see how you are." He said, "You're having a good time, aren't you?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he's looking at Marianne, who's oblivious because she's chewing gum. And I said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well, I'm the secretary to Bishop Sheen, who was the big television personality in those days. He was all over TV. And This was the Checker Car Company exhibition. He says, I'm here to pick up the car tomorrow. I have to make arrangements. They give it to the bishop free all year to use, and this is his car. We just had to use it for the exhibition as a return courtesy, and I have to pick it up tomorrow, so I'm making arrangements. He says, and I see you're having a wonderful time. And I said, yeah, thanks, Father. Enjoy yourself. See you later. Yeah. Well, the next day, I'm walking along the campus in St. John's, and who do I run into? Father Nugent. And he reaches out, touches my shoulder, and says, excuse me, would you like to go to confession today? I said, no, thanks. Certainly not with you. And we both laughed. And that was the last memory I have of St. John's. So I went on to law school. I got 1 semester of St. John's. I thought I was unjustly expelled academically, but that's the subject of another episode. I think it was number 15, blackballed. I talk about that in detail. There's no point in mentioning that now at this point in time. And I did go on to become a New York City teacher, a lawyer, and a judge. And in 2014, I was honored by the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Queens County as the Judge of the Year in Queens County. So, in closing, I have to look back and say my Catholic education was actually it was a great education, in spite of my efforts to fight it off. And I don't know if I.H.S. in my case stands for I have suffered, or I have survived, or I have succeeded. You decide. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.